Hello.
Echoes of the Dark. Part 1, 1885. The black cloak he wore flowed around him like a shadow. Its edges occasionally showed flashes of deep red satin underneath. In his left hand he held a wand made of hazelwood that was polished smooth and glistened as though it had been recently oiled with something sacred. It had been blessed with blood during a ritual. In his right hand he clutched a ceremonial dagger that was covered in ancient carvings tied to his faith. He bent down and began to draw a protective circle in the dirt at his feet. Each mark he made was deliberate and precise as he worked to create a boundary strong enough to contain the being he planned to summon. I could tell he was calm and confident even as he etched a large, outer circle in the ground. Inside it he drew a smaller circle, carefully filling the space between them with sacred inscriptions he had memorized long ago. He murmured something about calling upon an unseen force as his voice remained steady while he described what he wanted to happen. 3 obtuse triangles came next. He drew them one at a time, spacing them evenly apart and covering their points and centers with intricate sigils. When he finished, he stood back and looked over his work as though checking for any flaws. He spoke one final phrase about bringing forth the entity without delay and ensuring it stayed until his purpose was fulfilled. When everything was complete, he stepped into the very center of the circle and waited. Part 2. She asked if he wanted to go on a ghost tour, and her face glowed with excitement. He asked what it was, and she explained it was happening in downtown El Paso on Friday night. She suggested it could be a date night. He teased her and called it a history lesson, with glow sticks, but finally agreed. As the sun set over Cleveland Square, Lynn and Lee parked near the El Paso downtown library. They joined a small group of people who had gathered for the tour. Their guide Hector greeted everyone warmly, and his assistant handed out wristbands. Checking in was quick since Lynn had already purchased tickets online. The first stop was the library, which had been built in 1904 on the site of an old military cemetery. Hector shared stories of lingering spirits such as Civil War soldiers and a nurse in a cape. He described how a book had fallen off a shelf during an investigation without any explanation. Lee looked skeptical, but Lynn just hugged him closer. The group visited historic buildings designed by Henry C. Trost. She whispered that she would love to live there, but Lee disagreed and shook his head. Hector told the group how these tours helped raise awareness about historic buildings. Some property owners charged high fees for access, which made investigations difficult. He shared stories about old El Paso when it was known for saloons, outlaws, and wild gunfights. Finally, he led the group to the Franciscan Hotel. At the hotel, Hector lowered his voice and warned them about the basement. He said it housed something darker and joked that it was always the tough guys who asked to leave first. The group laughed nervously and followed him inside. Part 3, 1885. Alfred Crouse stood silently as a surge of energy built in the room. Tonight he would attempt the most dangerous summoning of his life. He planned to call forth the demon Choronzon from the abyss. Success would secure him a powerful position within Thelema's mystical order. El Paso was the perfect place for his ritual. The town thrived on vice, with gamblers, thieves, and outlaws far outnumbering law-abiding citizens. Crouse had used one successful poker game to secure his fortune and focus entirely on mastering the dark arts. Dust swirled faintly at his feet. He barely noticed as he continued, his incantation commanding the demon to appear and obey his will. The swirling energy grew stronger, forming a whirlwind that rose between his legs and caught him off guard. His heel smudged part of the protective triangle. A thin tendril of energy escaped the circle and darted into the shadows beyond. Choronzon emerged from the vortex. The demon rode a skeletal horse, its decayed face hidden behind a battered iron helmet with horns. Both rider and horse wore a cape of stitched human skin. The demon's voice filled Krause's mind in a sound both soothing and deafening. He struggled to stay steady but pressed on. Crouse welcomed the demon and bound it to the circle, ordering it to remain until his desires were fulfilled. Though the demon's voice rose and fell in his mind, its meaning was unclear. Still, he sensed it had acknowledged him. He spoke the dismissal, releasing the demon but commanding it to remain ready for future summons. The vortex collapsed inward and the room fell silent. He erased the symbols with his boot, folded his blood-streaked robe, and stored his wand and dagger. Underneath he wore a simple black suit, blending easily with the late-night crowd above. Part 4. At first, the Franciscan hotel's interior seemed bright and welcoming. The walls were painted white and pale tiles covered the floor. On closer inspection, Lynn saw thick layers of dust covering everything. The silence was profound, suggesting the place had been abandoned for years. The group followed Marcos down a narrow hallway. At the far end, he pried open a large wooden trapdoor in the floor. He warned everyone to watch their step and avoid touching the door, as it had a habit of slamming shut. Lee muttered that the place should be safer, and Lynn joked that the danger added to the atmosphere. Lee helped Lynn down the steep stairs, his protective nature stronger since her surgery. The group entered a stone-walled basement where the air was damp and stale with the scent of mold. Lynn wrinkled her nose as the group lit the space with phones and devices, labeled K2 meters and EVEP recorders. Marcos began an EVEP session, softly calling out to the child spirit said to haunt the basement. The equipment blinked occasionally, but reactions were minimal. Shadows danced faintly in the corners. Marcos asked if a darker spirit was silencing the child. Lynn leaned against Lee's back, whispering that she felt sore and tired. He rubbed her arm, gently staying silent to avoid disrupting the recordings. Marcos suddenly addressed the darker spirit, demanding it leave the child alone and face the group in the next room. Lynn sighed, feeling unimpressed and tired. Despite the eerie setting, she felt nothing supernatural. A few others in the group appeared pale and uneasy. Hector led two of them upstairs, leaving a sliver of light from the trap door before their footsteps faded. Marcos continued briefly, but the equipment grew quiet. He announced they would move to another room known for darker activity, and warned he would use stronger language. To provoke the spirit, the group entered a smaller storage area with a red exit sign glowing above a blocked stairwell. The air felt charged, and the mildew was replaced by a sharper scent. Marcos taunted the spirit, daring it to show its power. Suddenly, a heavy thumping echoed above. The sound moved toward the blocked stairwell, deliberate and loud. Marcos radioed Hector, who confirmed he was still upstairs with the others. The sound turned into hurried footsteps, making Marcos demand the spirit show itself. The K2 meter spiked red, and a foul sulfuric smell filled the room. Lynn's stomach turned, and she whispered to Lee about the odor. He held her close, asking if she was okay. The air grew thick, pressing in on the group. Lynn buried her face against Lee's shoulder, trying to block the nausea. Marcos finally announced it was time to leave. As the group moved toward the stairs, the trapdoor slammed shut with a deafening crack, making everyone jump. Part 5. Alfred Crouse walked along Mills Avenue, blending seamlessly with the crowd. He stopped suddenly as it struck him. He had done it. He had summoned and commanded a demon. He whispered to himself that he had actually done it. The people around him passed by obliviously. He stepped aside, leaning against the brick wall of a saloon, gripping his coin pouch tightly. Power surged through him, and he decided to test what he had gained. Within weeks, Crouse became a legend among the gambling halls and brothels along Utah Street. His skill at the faro table seemed unbeatable. No longer just another face in the crowd, he dressed like a high roller with black suits, brocade vests, and gold rings that gleamed under the gaslights. A jeweled stickpin adorned his lapel, while a gold chain hung from his pocket watch. He always carried twin pistols on his hips, prepared for trouble. At the faro table, he leaned back in his chair, studying the cards before him. His bets were placed carefully in patterns that guaranteed success. No dealer or rigged game could beat him. His winnings only grew with each night. A fiery-haired woman suddenly dropped onto his lap. He grinned and called her Mary Ann, telling her he was busy. She teased him, saying she admired a man who worked hard at drinking and betting. She handed him a glass of whiskey, and he took a sip as she leaned closer. Mary Ann owned one of the most popular brothels in El Paso. Their relationship was simple. He kept winning, and she ensured his nights were comfortable. She was sharp and controlled her girls with debts and strict rules. Crouse placed a final bet, winning big again. Mary Ann squealed in delight as he kissed her cheek and gathered his winnings. They returned to her establishment, where he saw her cunning as another gift from Choronzon. One afternoon, they were interrupted by furious knocking. Mary Ann opened the door to find Alice Huckster, her rival. The confrontation escalated quickly. Alice accused Mary Ann of spreading lies about her business. Mary Ann denied it, but her smirk said otherwise. Alice punched her hard. Mary Ann grabbed Crouse's pistol and stormed after her. Outside, she fired at Alice, who survived, but the act marked Mary Ann's decline. Her temper grew violent and her business faltered. Crouse found himself surrounded by danger too. Gamblers pulled guns on him, and fights became a constant threat. The thrill of power faded. He decided to break his pact. That night, Crouse returned to the basement of the Franciscan Hotel to sever his connection with Choronzon. He prepared a protective circle and began the ritual. The demon appeared once again on its skeletal horse. Crouse recited the dismissal, but the demon's grin widened as the air turned still. Its shadow struck him, breaking the circle. Desperate, Crouse shattered his wand against the demon's skull and plunged his dagger into its ribs. The demon dissolved into ash, but the shadow lingered, striking him again. He fled the basement into the night, tearing off his robe. As he stumbled onto the streets, passers-by stared at him with wide eyes. He heard the demon's voice mocking him, saying he could not escape. Heart-pounding, he ran toward Marianne's brothel, determined to leave the city before the demon claimed him. Part 6. Lynn slipped her arms around Lee and rested her head on his chest. She asked if they could go to the Dome Bar for a drink. Lee hesitated and said it was getting late. She insisted, saying she had not been there in years, and loved the stained glass ceiling that made it feel like drinking under the stars. They walked through San Jacinto Plaza, pausing by the alligator sculpture. Lynn asked why there were alligators in the park. Lee explained how live alligators had once been kept there as a tourist attraction. He said students had dragged them out for pranks, which put an end to the idea. She laughed and said he was making it up, but Lee insisted it was true. Inside the Dome Bar, Lynn admired the stained glass ceiling while they ordered their drinks. Lee showed her photos from the ghost tour, pointing out a strange light that appeared in one shot and vanished in the next. He also played an EP recording where faint whispering led to the word fool being spoken clearly. Days later, Hector confirmed the photos and recording were real, but at home things began to change. Lee became distant, drinking heavily and spending hours on online poker. One night, he shoved Lynn during an argument and yelled at her to run. His eyes turned completely black as his body jerked violently. Terrified, she fled as he tumbled down the stairs. In a panic, Lynn called Hector, who told her to meet him at Bassett Tower immediately. She joined him and Marcos, who planned to perform a ritual to protect Lee. They climbed to the 10th floor using the fire escape. Lynn carried salt and a prayer while Lee followed close behind, moving unnaturally fast. When they reached the 10th floor, Marcos smashed a window to get inside. Lynn quickly poured a salt circle on the floor. Lee arrived moments later, slamming into the barrier, unable to pass. Lynn read the prayer aloud, asking for protection and calling to her husband. Slowly, the darkness began to lift from his eyes. Lee collapsed inside the circle with tears streaming down his face. He whispered that he could not stop himself and had tried to fight it. Lynn knelt beside him and held him tightly. As sunlight poured through the windows, Hector suggested another ghost hunt, but Lee glared and refused without hesitation.